The autumn air in Millbrook County, Nebraska, carried the familiar scent of harvest time on the evening of October 15, 2023. The golden leaves of the cottonwood trees rustled in the gentle breeze as combines worked late into the evening, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness like beacons across the vast cornfields. For generations, this rural community of just over 3,000 residents had thrived on agriculture, where neighbors knew each other by name, church suppers brought the whole town together, and secrets were as rare as snow in July. Millbrook County had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, and where a handshake was still considered a binding contract. The county seat, also called Millbrook, consisted of a main street lined with family-owned businesses that had served the community for decades. Peterson's hardware store, where you could still buy penny candy from glass jars, sat next to Murphy's Diner, famous for its apple pie and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. The farming families of Millbrook County had weathered the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, countless floods and economic downturns that had destroyed other agricultural communities. They had survived because they took care of each other, sharing equipment during planting season, helping with harvests when illness struck a family, and gathering at the Methodist Church every Sunday to give thanks for their blessings and pray for those facing hardships. But as the sun set over the cornfields that evening of October 15th, casting long shadows across the landscape that had remained unchanged for generations, a discovery would shatter the peace of this small farming town forever. What happened that night would force the residents of Millbrook County to confront the possibility that evil could lurk behind the most familiar faces, and that the person sitting next to you in church might be harboring secrets dark enough to destroy lives. Thomas Brennan had worked his 200-acre farm for over 30 years, inheriting the land from his father, who had received it from his grandfather before him. The Brennan name was woven into the fabric of Millbrook County's history, appearing on old grain elevator records, church membership rolls, and school board minutes dating back to the 1890s. At 62, Thomas's weathered hands told the story of countless seasons spent tending to crops and livestock, of early mornings spent milking cows in the bitter cold, and of late nights during harvest, when every hour of good weather was precious. Thomas had been born in the same farmhouse where he now lived with his wife Margaret. He had attended Millbrook County Elementary, where he met Margaret Collins in 3rd grade. They had dated throughout high school, broken up when Thomas went to agricultural college at the University of Nebraska, and reunited when he returned home to take over the family farm. Their wedding in 1988 at the First Methodist Church of Millbrook had been the social event of the year, with over 400 guests celebrating the union of two of the county's oldest farming families. The couple had raised 3 children on the farm. Their eldest, Michael, had followed his father into agriculture but had moved to Iowa to farm with his wife's family. Their daughter, Sarah, worked as a nurse in Omaha and visited every few months with her 2 young children. Their youngest, David, had enlisted in the Army after high school and was currently stationed in Germany. Thomas often spoke proudly of his children's accomplishments, though Margaret sometimes noticed a sadness in his eyes when he talked about how none of them had chosen to stay and continue the family farming tradition. The red barn that would soon become the center of a criminal investigation had been built by Thomas's grandfather in 1952, replacing an earlier structure that had been destroyed by a tornado. It stood 90 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a gambrel roof that had been repaired and repainted countless times over the decades. The barn served as the heart of the farm operation, housing equipment worth over $200,000, including 2 tractors, a combine harvester, various implements for planting and cultivation, and enough storage space for several thousand bushels of grain. Local residents often used the barn as a reference point when giving directions, telling visitors to turn left at the red barn with the weather vane on top, or to continue straight until they passed the Brennan place with the big red barn. The structure had appeared in countless photographs over the years, serving as a backdrop for family portraits, graduation pictures, and even a few wedding photos for couples who wanted to capture the essence of rural Nebraska life. Thomas took pride in maintaining the barn, spending weekends painting, repairing, and organizing the interior. He had installed new electrical wiring in 2013, updated the ventilation system to protect stored grain from moisture, and added modern LED lighting throughout the structure. Neighbors often commented on how well-kept the Brennan farm looked, with its neatly painted buildings, well-maintained equipment, and fields that were always planted and harvested on schedule. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect farming operation, Financial pressures had been mounting for several years. The Brennan family, like many agricultural operations across the Midwest, had been struggling with declining commodity prices, increased costs for fuel and fertilizer, and unpredictable weather patterns that made farming more challenging than ever before. Thomas had taken out loans against the farm to purchase new equipment and expand his operation, betting that increased production would offset rising costs. The bet had not paid off. Crop yields had been below average for 3 consecutive years, and the prices Thomas received for his corn and soybeans had failed to keep pace with his expenses. By the fall of 2023, the farm was carrying debt of over $400,000, with monthly payments that consumed nearly all of the family's income. Thomas had begun selling equipment and livestock to make ends meet, but he had kept these financial struggles largely secret from his wife and the community. Margaret Brennan had noticed changes in her husband's behavior over the past year, but she attributed them to the normal stresses of farming. Thomas had always been a quiet man who kept his worries to himself, and she respected his need to handle problems in his own way. She had managed the household finances for 35 years of marriage, but Thomas had always handled the farm's business accounts, telling her that he didn't want to burden her with the complexities of agricultural economics. What Margaret didn't know was that Thomas had been visiting the bank every few weeks for meetings with loan officers, exploring options for restructuring his debt, and seeking additional credit to keep the operation afloat. The bank, which had been the Brennan family's financial partner for 3 generations, was becoming increasingly concerned about the farm's ability to service its existing debt, much less take on additional obligations. Nobody could have imagined that this familiar red barn, which had weathered 7 decades of Nebraska storms and served as a symbol of the Brennan family's commitment to agriculture, would become the center of one of the most disturbing discoveries in the county's history. The structure that had housed Christmas parties, graduation celebrations, and countless community gatherings would soon be reduced to ash and debris, revealing secrets that would forever change how the people of Millbrook County viewed their neighbor, their community, and their own ability to truly know the people closest to them. The evening of October 15th started like any other autumn day on the Brennan farm. Thomas had spent the morning combining corn in the south field, working to take advantage of the dry weather before the forecast rain arrived later in the week. The rhythm of harvest season was one he had known his entire life. Early morning equipment checks, long days in the field, and evenings spent planning the next day's work. Margaret had prepared Thomas's favorite dinner that evening: pot roast with potatoes and carrots, cornbread made from their own cornmeal, and apple pie using apples from the tree that Thomas's grandmother had planted behind the house in 1945. The couple had settled into their usual routine, eating dinner while watching the evening news and discussing plans for the weekend. Thomas seemed more relaxed than he had been in weeks, Margaret would later tell investigators. He had even mentioned taking a day off to attend their granddaughter's soccer game in Omaha, something he rarely did during harvest season. Margaret had been pleased to see some of the tension leave her husband's shoulders, unaware that the apparent improvement in his mood might have been related to decisions he had already made about their desperate financial situation. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, Margaret glanced out the kitchen window while clearing the dinner dishes and noticed what appeared to be an unusual orange glow coming from the direction of the barn. At first, she thought it might be the reflection of the setting sun on the metal roof, or perhaps Thomas had turned on the new LED work lights he had installed earlier that year. But as she watched, the glow grew brighter and began to flicker in a way that sent a chill down her spine. Margaret had lived on farms her entire life, and she knew the difference between electric lights and flames. She dropped the plate she was holding, barely noticing as it shattered on the kitchen floor, and called out to Thomas, who was in the living room reading the local newspaper. The couple rushed outside together, Thomas grabbing his cell phone from the kitchen counter as they ran toward the back door. The sight that greeted them was every farmer's worst nightmare. Their barn, the centerpiece of their operation and the repository of their life's work, was engulfed in flames that reached toward the darkening sky like grasping fingers. The fire had already consumed most of the structure's roof, and flames were shooting through every window and door opening. The heat was so intense that they could feel it on their faces from over 100 yards away. The sound was unlike anything Margaret had ever heard, a roaring, crackling symphony of destruction that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Thomas immediately dialed 911, his voice shaking as he reported the emergency to the dispatcher. "This is Thomas Brennan at 4847 County Road 15. Our barn is on fire. It's completely engulfed. We need the fire department here immediately." The dispatcher, Jenny Morrison, who had known the Brennan family for years, assured Thomas that help was on the way and advised the couple to move to a safe distance and ensure that no one was inside the burning structure. As they stood watching helplessly, Thomas began mentally calculating the losses. The barn contained both of his tractors, his combine harvester, several $1,000s worth of hand tools, and approximately 5,000 bushels of this year's corn crop that he had been planning to sell after the first of the year, when prices typically increased. The financial impact would be devastating, potentially enough to force him into bankruptcy and cost him the farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. Margaret reached for her husband's hand and was surprised to find that he was trembling. While anyone would be upset by such a catastrophic loss, Thomas seemed almost paralyzed by what they were witnessing. She tried to reassure him that insurance would cover most of their losses, but Thomas just shook his head and muttered something about it being too late, words that Margaret didn't fully understand at the time. The wind that evening seemed to conspire against any firefighting efforts, gusting from the southwest and feeding oxygen to the flames while pushing the fire toward the farm's other buildings. Thomas realized that if the wind direction didn't change, the fire could spread to their machine shed, which contained additional equipment and possibly even reach their propane tank, which could create an explosion that would threaten their house and potentially other nearby structures. Neighbors began arriving within minutes of seeing the flames or hearing the emergency radio traffic. Jim Patterson, whose farm bordered the Brennan property to the east, was the first to arrive, bringing his own water tank and pump in case additional firefighting resources were needed. Behind him came the Kowalski family, the Hendersons, and a dozen other neighbors who dropped everything to help friends in crisis. This response was typical of rural Nebraska communities, where barn fires were considered everyone's emergency. Neighbors understood that the farmer who lost a barn today might be the one providing assistance when their own disaster struck tomorrow. The unwritten code of mutual support had held these communities together through generations of hardships, and tonight would be no different. Fire Chief Robert Martinez and his crew from the Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department received the emergency call at 7:34 in the evening. Martinez, a 30-year veteran of firefighting who worked as a mechanic during the day, immediately recognized the address and knew they were dealing with a significant structure fire at one of the county's most prominent farms. The Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department operated with 2 engines, 1 ladder truck, and a tanker that could carry 3,000 gallons of water. While the department had an excellent reputation and well-trained volunteers, barn fires in rural areas were always challenging due to the distance from water sources and the speed with which agricultural structures could be consumed by flames. Martinez called for mutual aid from 3 neighboring departments while en route to the scene, knowing that they would need additional water and manpower to have any chance of saving other structures on the property. The response included departments from Riverside, Cedar Creek, and Columbus, creating a convoy of emergency vehicles racing through the Nebraska countryside toward the Brennan farm. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who served as the department's training officer in addition to her duties as a paramedic, was among the first firefighters to arrive at the scene. Chen had been with the department for 15 years and had fought dozens of structure fires, but she would later describe the Brennan barn fire as one of the most intense she had ever encountered. The flames had reached heights of nearly 60 feet by the time the first fire trucks arrived, creating a pillar of fire and smoke that was visible from Riverside, 8 miles to the northeast. The heat was so intense that firefighters had to maintain a distance of at least 100 feet while directing water onto the structure, making it impossible to mount any kind of interior attack or rescue operation. The strategy quickly shifted from saving the barn to preventing the fire from spreading to other structures. Firefighters positioned themselves between the burning barn and the machine shed, soaking the roof and walls of the secondary building with water to prevent ignition from flying embers. Another crew focused on protecting the propane tank, which was located just 50 yards from the main fire and represented the greatest immediate danger to both firefighters and the surrounding property. As additional crews arrived, Martinez was able to establish a more comprehensive firefighting operation. Water was shuttled from a pond located half a mile away, with tanker trucks making continuous trips to keep the engines supplied. The operation required coordination between 4 different fire departments and over 30 volunteer firefighters, representing one of the largest emergency responses in the county's recent history. Despite their best efforts, the barn was clearly beyond saving. The structure's wooden frame, dried by decades of Nebraska summers, burned with an intensity that made firefighting efforts feel almost futile. The metal roofing began to collapse around 8:15, sending showers of sparks high into the evening sky and creating new spot fires in the surrounding grass that had to be quickly extinguished. Thomas and Margaret Brennan, along with their gathered neighbors, stood in a line about 200 yards from the fire, watching 70 years of family history disappear in a matter of hours. The barn had housed countless memories: Christmas parties where the entire community gathered to celebrate the holiday season, graduation parties for all three Brennan children, and dozens of other gatherings that had strengthened the bonds within their rural community. Margaret found herself thinking about the family photographs that had been stored in the barn's loft, images dating back to the early days of the farm that documented 3 generations of Brennan family life. She thought about Thomas's collection of antique tools that had belonged to his father and grandfather, implements that would never again be used, but had represented an important connection to the past. Thomas seemed lost in his own thoughts, occasionally shaking his head or muttering words that Margaret couldn't quite hear over the noise of the fire and the emergency response. When neighbors approached to offer condolences and assistance, Thomas thanked them politely but seemed distracted, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. By 9 o'clock, the fire had largely burned itself out, leaving only smoldering ruins where the barn had stood just 2 hours earlier. The emergency responders began the process of checking for hotspots and ensuring that the fire was completely extinguished, a process that would continue throughout the night. As the excitement of the immediate emergency began to fade, conversations among the neighbors turned to practical matters. How much insurance coverage did the Brennans carry? What equipment had been lost? How would Thomas manage the rest of his harvest without the machinery that had been destroyed? These were the kinds of questions that agricultural communities always faced after disasters, and the neighbors were already beginning to organize assistance. Several farmers offered the use of their equipment to help Thomas complete his harvest. Others promised to help with the cleanup and rebuilding process. The Methodist Church began planning a fundraiser to help offset the family's losses. This outpouring of support was exactly what Margaret had expected from their community, and it gave her hope that they would be able to recover from this setback. But as the crowd began to thin and neighbors started returning to their own homes, Margaret noticed that Thomas remained distant and preoccupied. When she asked if he was all right, he simply nodded and said he needed to walk around the ruins to try to assess their losses. Something in his tone worried her, but she attributed his mood to the shock of losing so much in such a short time. Fire Chief Martinez and Lieutenant Chen remained at the scene throughout the night, monitoring the smoldering debris and ensuring that no new fires developed. As dawn approached and the immediate danger passed, Martinez began to consider the investigation that would be required to determine the cause of the fire and whether any safety violations or insurance issues might be involved. Something about the fire troubled Martinez, though he couldn't immediately identify what was bothering him. The intensity and speed of the burn seemed unusual, even for a structure filled with dry hay and old wood. The fire had consumed the building with an almost explosive force that suggested the presence of accelerants or other factors that weren't immediately apparent. Martinez made a mental note to request a thorough investigation by the state fire marshal's office, not because he suspected arson, but because the insurance claim would likely be substantial, and the cause needed to be definitively determined. He had no way of knowing that this routine decision would ultimately lead to discoveries that would change everything about how the community viewed the Brennan family and the fire that had destroyed their barn. As the crew worked through the night, something puzzled Chief Martinez about the fire's behavior. He had investigated hundreds of structure fires during his 30-year career, from house fires caused by faulty electrical wiring to industrial accidents involving hazardous materials. This fire burned with an intensity that seemed beyond the normal parameters for a barn fire, even considering the dry wood construction and stored agricultural materials. The flames had reached their peak intensity remarkably quickly, suggesting either the presence of accelerants or unusual draft conditions that had fed oxygen to the fire at an extraordinary rate. Martinez observed burn patterns in the debris that seemed inconsistent with a fire that had started accidentally, though he was careful not to jump to conclusions without proper investigation. By dawn, all that remained of the century-old barn was a skeletal framework of charred wooden beams and a foundation filled with ash and debris. The metal roofing had collapsed inward, creating a twisted sculpture of destruction that bore no resemblance to the structure that had stood there just 12 hours earlier. The Brennan family stood watching as smoke continued to rise from the smoldering remains, creating ghostly wisps that drifted across the farm fields in the morning breeze. Thomas estimated his losses at over $80,000, a figure that included the destroyed equipment, stored grain, and the barn structure itself. For a farming operation that was already struggling financially, this loss represented a potential death blow that could force the family to sell their land and end 3 generations of agricultural tradition. But financial concerns would soon become the least of their worries, as the investigation that was about to begin would uncover secrets that no amount of insurance money could address. Fire Inspector Janet Richardson arrived at the scene around 9 in the morning, accompanied by Deputy Sheriff Michael Torres and Assistant Fire Chief David Kim from the State Fire Marshal's office. Richardson had built a reputation over 20 years of investigation as one of the most thorough and methodical fire investigators in the region, with a conviction rate that approached 90% in cases where arson was suspected. Richardson's approach to fire investigation was legendary among her colleagues for its attention to detail and scientific rigor. She had studied chemical engineering before entering fire service and brought a level of technical expertise to her investigations that often revealed evidence that less trained investigators might miss. Her reports were so comprehensive that defense attorneys rarely challenged her findings, knowing that she could support every conclusion with photographic evidence and scientific analysis. The initial walkthrough of the perimeter revealed several points of interest that Richardson documented, with both digital photography and hand-drawn sketches. She noted the wind direction at the time of the fire, the proximity of power lines and electrical equipment, and the location of the family's vehicles and other potential ignition sources. The systematic approach would continue for several days, with every piece of debris being cataloged and analyzed. The fire appeared to have started in the southwest corner of the barn, based on the burn patterns visible in the debris and the testimony of witnesses who had observed the early stages of the fire. This corner of the building housed Thomas's workshop area, where he maintained and repaired farm equipment during the winter months. The workshop contained welding equipment, power tools, electrical devices, and various chemicals used in equipment maintenance. Richardson's initial hypothesis focused on the possibility of an electrical malfunction or an accident involving welding equipment. Barn fires often started when farmers worked late into the evening on equipment repairs, especially during busy seasons when maintenance was often deferred until problems became urgent. A dropped welding rod, an overloaded electrical circuit, or a chemical spill near a heat source could easily ignite the dry materials that filled most agricultural buildings. Thomas Brennan provided a detailed account of the evening's events to both Richardson and Deputy Torres. He explained that he had been in the barn around 5 in the afternoon, checking on his tractor and organizing some tools for the next day's work. Everything had seemed normal during his visit. He noticed no unusual smells, sounds, or electrical issues that might have indicated developing problems. The building had been rewired 10 years earlier by a licensed electrician from Columbus, and Thomas had always been careful about fire safety, maintaining clear areas around any heat sources and ensuring that flammable materials were properly stored. He had installed smoke detectors in the barn 2 years earlier, though the units had been destroyed in the fire before they could provide any useful information about how the blaze had developed. Thomas's account of his activities that evening seemed straightforward and consistent with the normal routines of a farmer during harvest season. He had spent most of the day combining corn, had returned to the barn briefly to check on equipment, and had then gone to the house for dinner with his wife. The timeline left several hours between his visit to the barn and the discovery of the fire, plenty of time for an electrical problem or other accidental cause to develop into a major blaze. Deputy Torres, who had known the Brennan family for years through his work in the rural community, observed Thomas carefully during the initial interview. While the farmer seemed appropriately upset about the loss of his barn and equipment, Torres noticed a level of nervousness that seemed to go beyond what the situation warranted. Thomas appeared jumpy and distracted, frequently checking his watch and glancing toward the road as if expecting someone to arrive. Margaret Brennan corroborated her husband's account of the evening's events, confirming that he had been in the house with her from approximately 5:30 until they discovered the fire at 7:30. She mentioned to Richardson that Thomas had seemed worried about something in recent weeks but had not shared the specific nature of his concerns. When pressed for details, Margaret explained that farming was always stressful, especially during harvest season, and she had attributed her husband's mood to the normal pressures of their agricultural operation. Torres made a note to follow up with a more detailed interview once the initial shock of the fire had worn off. His experience in rural law enforcement had taught him that farmers often dealt with pressures that they didn't share with their families, including financial difficulties, crop failures, and equipment problems that could threaten their livelihoods. Sometimes these stresses led to poor decisions, including insurance fraud schemes that involved deliberately set fires. As Richardson and her team began the painstaking process of sifting through the debris, they followed protocols that had been developed through decades of fire investigation experience. They started from the area of least damage and worked systematically toward what appeared to be the point of origin, documenting each layer of debris with photographs and detailed measurements. The process was slow and methodical, requiring hours of careful work to remove debris without disturbing potential evidence. Richardson used specialized tools designed for fire investigation, including brushes, screens, and probes that allowed her to examine materials without destroying them. Every significant finding was photographed from multiple angles and precisely measured in relation to fixed reference points. Assistant Fire Chief Kim supervised the evidence collection process, ensuring that chain of custody procedures were followed and that all findings were properly documented. Kim had worked with Richardson on over 100 fire investigations and knew that the thoroughness of their initial work would determine whether any eventual legal proceedings would be successful. The investigation team worked in a grid pattern, dividing the barn's footprint into sections that were examined individually. Each section was photographed before excavation began, then systematically cleared of debris, while investigators looked for evidence of accelerants, electrical problems, or other potential causes of the fire. The process was tedious but essential, as crucial evidence could be hidden beneath layers of ash and collapsed roofing material. Margaret Brennan brought coffee and sandwiches to the investigators around noon, a gesture that was typical of the community's supportive nature, but also provided an opportunity for Richardson to observe the family's interactions and demeanor. Margaret seemed genuinely concerned about the investigation's progress and expressed hope that the cause would be determined quickly so that insurance claims could be processed and rebuilding could begin. Thomas remained distant during this interaction, thanking the investigators for their work but seeming preoccupied with something else. Richardson noted that he asked several questions about how long the investigation might take and whether the debris would need to be preserved after the cause was determined. While these questions might simply reflect a farmer's practical concerns about cleaning up his property, they could also indicate worry about what the investigation might discover. The breakthrough that would change everything about the case came around 3 p.m, 6 hours into the detailed investigation. Richardson was working in a section near what had been the barn's central support beam when her probe struck something that felt distinctly different from the expected mixture of ash, nails, and wood fragments. Using brushes and small hand tools, Richardson began to carefully expose what appeared to be fabric buried beneath several inches of debris. At first she thought it might be old tarps or canvas that had been used to cover equipment, materials that were commonly found in agricultural buildings. But as more material was revealed, the shape and texture became unmistakably recognizable. Richardson was looking at human clothing, and beneath that clothing, the unmistakable outline of what could only be human remains. The discovery sent a chill through the experienced investigator, who had seen many disturbing scenes during her career, but had never encountered human remains in what was supposed to be a routine fire investigation. The implications of the discovery were immediately apparent to everyone at the scene. What had begun as a standard fire investigation into a possible insurance claim had suddenly become something far more serious, a potential homicide investigation that would require completely different expertise and procedures. Richardson immediately secured the area and contacted her supervisor at the State Fire Marshal's office, who in turn notified the State Police Criminal Investigation Division. The scene was cordoned off with crime scene tape, and a larger perimeter was established to ensure that no potential evidence was disturbed by curious onlookers or well-meaning neighbors. The Brennan family was informed of the discovery and asked to remain available for additional questioning, though they were allowed to remain in their home under the observation of a deputy sheriff. The announcement that human remains had been found in the barn ruins sent shockwaves through the rural community, where violent crime was virtually unknown, and the most serious offenses typically involved vandalism or driving under the influence. As word of the discovery spread through Millbrook County, residents struggled to process the implications of what had been found at the Brennan farm. The tight-knit community was unaccustomed to dealing with serious crime, and the possibility that someone had died and been concealed in one of their neighbors' buildings challenged everything they thought they knew about their community and the people they trusted. Detective Lieutenant Amanda Foster arrived from the state capitol within 2 hours of Richardson's discovery, accompanied by a comprehensive forensic team that included specialists in crime scene photography, evidence collection, and forensic anthropology. Foster had spent 15 years with the State Police Criminal Investigation Division, working her way up from patrol officer through detective to her current position as one of the state's most experienced homicide investigators. Foster's reputation within law enforcement circles was built on her methodical approach to complex cases and her ability to piece together evidence that other investigators might overlook. She had successfully solved dozens of homicide cases throughout Nebraska, including several that had initially appeared to be accidents or suicides, but proved to be carefully planned murders. Her clearance rate was among the highest in the state, and defense attorneys knew that cases involving Foster's investigation would be built on solid evidence and thorough documentation. The forensic team that accompanied Foster represented some of the most advanced investigative capabilities available to rural law enforcement agencies. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Nebraska, would lead the examination and recovery of the human remains. Crime scene photographer Dennis Chang would document every aspect of the investigation with digital photography and video recording. Evidence technician Maria Santos would oversee the collection and preservation of physical evidence that might be crucial to understanding what had happened at the Brennan farm. The county coroner, Dr. Elizabeth Vaughn, arrived shortly after the state team and immediately took charge of the medical aspects of the investigation. Dr. Vaughn had served as coroner for Millbrook County for 12 years, dealing primarily with deaths from natural causes, farm accidents, and occasional automobile collisions. The discovery of human remains in suspicious circumstances represented the most significant case of her career, and she understood that her findings would be crucial to any eventual prosecution. Foster's first action was to expand the crime scene perimeter and establish a command post that would coordinate the various aspects of the investigation. She understood that what had started as a fire investigation was now a potential homicide case that would require expertise from multiple agencies and disciplines. The next few hours would be critical in preserving evidence and establishing the facts that would guide the entire investigation. The immediate area around Richardson's discovery was cordoned off with additional crime scene tape, and a larger perimeter was established to ensure the integrity of potential evidence that might be located elsewhere on the property. Foster ordered a complete search of the farm buildings, vehicles, and surrounding areas, knowing that crucial evidence might be found far from the barn ruins. The Brennan family was relocated to a neighbor's house while the investigation continued, though they remained under the discreet surveillance of plainclothes officers. Foster understood that while Thomas and Margaret Brennan had not been formally identified as suspects, their proximity to the crime scene and their knowledge of the property made them persons of interest who needed to be monitored carefully. As the forensic team began the delicate process of excavating the human remains, Dr. Williams employed techniques that she had learned from archaeological fieldwork and forensic investigations. Each bone fragment and piece of evidence was photographed in place before being carefully removed and preserved for laboratory analysis. The process was painstakingly slow, requiring hours of work to ensure that no crucial evidence was lost or contaminated. The positioning of the remains provided immediate clues about what might have happened. The body was found in a section of the barn that Thomas Brennan had claimed to use regularly for equipment storage, making it difficult to understand how he could have failed to notice a decomposing corpse during his daily activities. The remains were positioned in a way that suggested they had been deliberately concealed beneath stored materials, rather than being the victim of an accidental death or collapse. Dr. Vaughn's preliminary examination of the remains, conducted at the scene before they were transported to the state crime laboratory, revealed several important details. The state of decomposition suggested that the individual had been deceased for several weeks, possibly longer before the fire occurred. This timeline meant that the person had not died in the fire, but had been dead and concealed in the barn when the blaze started. The examination also revealed evidence of trauma that appeared to be inconsistent with accidental death. While Dr. Vaughn was careful not to make premature conclusions before completing a full autopsy, she noted what appeared to be fractures to the skull that could indicate blunt force trauma. These injuries would require detailed analysis to determine whether they had occurred before death and whether they might have been the cause of death. Foster's team worked through the night, using portable lighting systems to continue the excavation and evidence collection process. The investigation had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies throughout the region, and Foster received offers of assistance from several neighboring jurisdictions. The magnitude of the case and its potential impact on the rural community meant that every available resource would be dedicated to solving it quickly and thoroughly. By the following morning, the forensic team had recovered what appeared to be the complete remains of an adult individual, along with personal effects that had survived the fire. Among these items were fragments of jewelry, buttons from clothing, and most importantly, a wallet that had been protected from the flames by its position beneath the body and several layers of debris. The wallet contained identification documents that would prove to be the key to understanding what had happened at the Brennan farm. The driver's license belonged to Marcus Chen, a 34-year-old resident of Columbus, Nebraska, who worked as a sales representative for agricultural equipment. The discovery of Marcus's identification immediately provided investigators with a starting point for understanding who the victim was and how he might have come to be at the Brennan farm. Foster immediately contacted the Columbus Police Department to gather information about Marcus Chen and to determine whether he had been reported missing. The response she received would add another layer of complexity to an already puzzling case. Marcus had indeed been reported missing 6 weeks earlier, but the circumstances of his disappearance had led investigators to assume that he had left voluntarily. According to the missing person report filed by Marcus's girlfriend, Lisa Rodriguez, Marcus had been visiting farms throughout the region as part of his work selling irrigation equipment when he simply vanished. His car had been found abandoned in a grocery store parking lot in Platte County, 3 counties away from Millbrook, leading investigators to assume that Marcus had chosen to disappear for personal reasons rather than being the victim of foul play. Lisa Rodriguez had told police that Marcus had been under stress in recent months due to poor sales performance and financial difficulties, factors that made voluntary disappearance seem plausible. The Columbus Police Department had conducted a routine investigation, but had found no evidence of criminal activity, and had classified the case as a missing person who had likely left the area voluntarily. The discovery of Marcus's remains in the Brennan barn completely changed the nature of the investigation and raised troubling questions about how thoroughly the initial missing person case had been investigated. Foster immediately requested all records related to Marcus's disappearance and began the process of reconstructing his activities during the weeks before he vanished. Marcus Chen had worked for Midwest Agricultural Solutions, a company based in Lincoln that manufactured and sold irrigation equipment to farmers throughout Nebraska and neighboring states. According to his supervisor, David Park, Marcus had been struggling with sales quotas in recent months but had shown renewed enthusiasm in the weeks before his disappearance. He had been working longer hours, making more sales calls, and had even expressed optimism about meeting his annual goals. Park provided Foster with Marcus's sales records and appointment schedules, which showed that he had been visiting farms throughout central Nebraska in the weeks before he disappeared. The records indicated that Marcus had been carrying a significant amount of cash for demonstrations and immediate sales, as many farmers in the region preferred to conduct business with cash payments rather than credit arrangements. This information provided a potential motive for Marcus's murder, robbery. If Thomas Brennan had been aware that Marcus was carrying cash, the struggling farmer might have seen an opportunity to solve his financial problems through violence. The theory was speculative at this point, but it provided a logical explanation for why an equipment salesman would end up dead and hidden in a farmer's barn. Foster's next step was to conduct detailed interviews with Thomas and Margaret Brennan to determine what connection, if any, they had with Marcus Chen. The discovery of the body on their property made them immediate suspects, but Foster was careful to approach the interviews as information-gathering sessions rather than accusations. She understood that premature allegations could compromise the investigation and potentially allow a guilty party to escape justice. The interview with Thomas Brennan took place at the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office, where Foster could control the environment and record the conversation for later analysis. Thomas appeared nervous and distracted, frequently asking about when he would be able to return to his normal activities and when the investigation of his property would be completed. When Foster asked Thomas about his knowledge of Marcus Chen, his initial response was one of apparent confusion and denial. Thomas claimed to have no memory of meeting anyone by that name and insisted that he had never done business with irrigation equipment salesmen. He maintained that his farming operation was too small to justify the expense of installing irrigation systems and that he had never seriously considered such an investment. However, When Foster presented Thomas with phone records showing multiple calls between his number and Marcus's cell phone in the weeks before the disappearance, Thomas's story began to change. Faced with irrefutable evidence of contact between himself and the victim, Thomas admitted that Marcus had indeed visited the farm to discuss irrigation equipment, but maintained that the meeting had ended normally. According to Thomas's revised account, Marcus had spent approximately an hour at the farm, examining the fields and discussing various irrigation options. Thomas claimed that he had been polite, but had ultimately decided that the equipment was too expensive for his operation. He said that Marcus had accepted his decision gracefully and had left to visit other potential customers in the area. Thomas's explanation for why he had initially denied knowing Marcus was that he met with many salespeople throughout the year and had simply forgotten about this particular visit. He claimed that the stress of harvest season and the recent fire had affected his memory, and that he had not considered the meeting significant enough to remember without prompting. Foster found Thomas's explanation suspicious for several reasons. First, the phone records showed that Marcus had called Thomas's number 3 times, with 2 of those conversations lasting more than 10 minutes. This suggested more extensive contact than a simple sales visit would typically require. Second, Thomas's initial denial of any contact with Marcus seemed deliberate, rather than the result of poor memory, especially given the significance of the current investigation. Margaret Brennan's interview provided additional information that raised questions about Thomas's truthfulness. Margaret told Foster that she had been visiting her sister in Iowa during the time period when Marcus would have visited the farm, meaning that Thomas had been alone during the meeting. More significantly, Margaret said that Thomas had never mentioned meeting with any irrigation equipment salesman, which seemed unusual given the potential cost and importance of such a purchase. Margaret's absence during the crucial time period meant that she could not corroborate Thomas's account of what had happened during Marcus's visit. It also meant that Thomas had been alone with Marcus during whatever events had led to the salesman's death, providing both opportunity and privacy for committing murder without witnesses. As Foster continued her investigation, she began to develop a clearer picture of Thomas Brennan's financial situation and the pressures that might have motivated him to commit robbery and murder. Bank records obtained through search warrants revealed that the Brennan farm was in serious financial distress, with loan payments that consumed nearly all of the family's income and debt that totaled over $400,000. The financial records showed that Thomas had been meeting regularly with bank officials in recent months, trying to restructure his loans and avoid foreclosure. The bank had been increasingly reluctant to extend additional credit, and Thomas was facing the possibility of losing the farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. This desperate financial situation provided a clear motive for robbing Marcus Chen, especially if Thomas knew that the salesman was carrying cash. Foster also discovered that Thomas had recently increased the insurance coverage on his barn and equipment, a fact that raised suspicions about whether the fire had been deliberately set to collect insurance proceeds while destroying evidence of Marcus's murder. The timing of the increased coverage, just 3 months before the fire, seemed too coincidental to ignore. Marcus Chen had lived what appeared to be an ordinary life before his disappearance, working hard to build a career in agricultural sales and planning a future with his girlfriend Lisa Rodriguez. Born in California to parents who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s, Marcus had grown up in San Francisco before moving to Nebraska to attend the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he studied agricultural business and developed a passion for helping farmers improve their operations. After graduation, Marcus had worked for several agricultural companies before joining Midwest Agricultural Solutions 3 years earlier. His colleagues described him as dedicated and honest, someone who genuinely cared about helping farmers rather than simply making sales. He had built a reputation for providing thorough consultation and follow-up service, often visiting farms multiple times to ensure that equipment was properly installed and functioning correctly. Lisa Rodriguez, who worked as a nurse at Columbus Community Hospital, had been dating Marcus for 2 years and described their relationship as serious and committed. They had recently begun discussing marriage and had been looking at houses in Columbus where they could start their life together. Lisa told investigators that Marcus had been excited about his work in the weeks before his disappearance, mentioning several promising sales prospects that could help him meet his annual goals. According to Lisa, Marcus had been carrying more cash than usual during his final weeks, explaining that several farmers had expressed interest in making immediate purchases if the price was right. He typically carried between $10,000 and $15,000 in his vehicle for demonstrations and quick sales. money that was provided by his employer for exactly these situations. This cash was never recovered from Marcus's abandoned vehicle, leading investigators to initially assume that he had taken the money when he left voluntarily. The discovery of Marcus's remains in the Brennan barn completely invalidated the theory of voluntary disappearance and forced investigators to reconsider every aspect of his final weeks. Foster's team began the process of reconstructing Marcus's movements and activities, using phone records, GPS data from his company vehicle, and interviews with farmers he had visited to create a timeline of his final days. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been working systematically through a list of potential customers in central Nebraska, visiting farms that had expressed interest in irrigation equipment or that met the demographic profile for his products. His sales strategy involved cold calling farmers to set up appointments, followed by on-site visits where he could assess their needs and demonstrate equipment capabilities. Marcus's company vehicle, a white Ford pickup truck equipped with equipment samples and promotional materials, had been found in the parking lot of a grocery store in Platte County, approximately 60 miles from the Brennan farm. The vehicle had been thoroughly searched when Marcus was first reported missing, but investigators had found no evidence of foul play. The truck contained Marcus's normal business materials, but none of the cash he had been carrying, reinforcing the initial theory that he had left voluntarily. Foster's team re-examined the vehicle using more sophisticated forensic techniques, looking for evidence that might have been missed during the original investigation. Forensic technicians found traces of blood in the truck bed that had been obscured by rust and weather damage, blood that DNA testing would later confirm belonged to Marcus Chen. This discovery suggested that Marcus had been injured, possibly fatally, before his body was transported to the Brennan farm. The blood evidence also raised questions about the timeline of events and the location where Marcus had actually been killed. If he had been murdered at the Brennan farm, there would have been no reason for his blood to be in his own vehicle. The evidence suggested a more complex scenario where Marcus had been attacked elsewhere, transported to the Brennan farm, and then concealed in the barn where his body would not be discovered. Dr. Vaughn's autopsy results, completed at the State Crime Laboratory in Lincoln, provided crucial information about how Marcus had died and when the fatal injuries had occurred. The examination revealed evidence of severe blunt force trauma to the head, with fractures to the skull that would have been immediately fatal. The pattern of injuries suggested that Marcus had been struck multiple times with a heavy object, possibly a tool or piece of farm equipment. The autopsy also revealed defensive wounds on Marcus's hands and arms, indicating that he had attempted to protect himself during the attack. These injuries suggested that Marcus had been conscious and aware of the threat he faced, ruling out the possibility that he had been killed accidentally or during a struggle that had escalated beyond the attacker's intentions. Toxicology tests revealed no evidence of drugs or alcohol in Marcus's system, indicating that he had been fully alert and capable during the events that led to his death. The absence of any substances that might have impaired his judgment or physical capabilities suggested that the attack had been sudden and overwhelming, giving Marcus little opportunity to escape or defend himself effectively. The forensic examination of Marcus's clothing and personal effects provided additional clues about the circumstances of his death. His clothes showed evidence of being dragged across rough surfaces, with tears and abrasions that suggested his body had been moved after death. Soil samples embedded in the fabric matched samples taken from various locations around the Brennan farm, providing physical evidence that Marcus had been at the farm when he died. Foster's investigation team conducted an extensive search of the Brennan property, looking for the location where Marcus had actually been killed, and for any physical evidence that might have been left behind. The search included the use of ground-penetrating radar to look for buried evidence, metal detectors to find weapons or other objects that might have been discarded, and specialized chemical testing to detect traces of blood that might not be visible to the naked eye. The breakthrough in understanding where the murder had occurred came when investigators discovered traces of blood in Thomas Brennan's workshop, a separate building located about 50 yards from the barn. The workshop contained welding equipment, hand tools, and various machinery used for farm equipment repair, providing numerous potential murder weapons that could have caused Marcus's fatal injuries. The blood found in the workshop was initially detected using luminol, a chemical that causes blood to fluoresce under ultraviolet light, even after attempts have been made to clean it. The pattern of blood spatter suggested that a violent attack had occurred in the workshop, with evidence indicating that someone had attempted to clean up the scene, but had been unsuccessful in removing all traces of blood. DNA testing confirmed that the blood found in the workshop belonged to Marcus Chen, providing physical evidence that linked him to the location where he had been killed. The discovery also supported the theory that Marcus had been murdered elsewhere on the property and then moved to the barn for concealment, rather than being killed in the barn itself. The forensic analysis of the workshop revealed additional evidence that helped investigators understand what had happened during Marcus's final moments. Tool marks on the concrete floor suggested that heavy objects had been dragged across the surface, possibly Marcus's body being moved after the attack. Paint chips and metal fragments found near the blood evidence matched samples taken from tools in the workshop, suggesting that one of these implements had been used as the murder weapon. Foster's team conducted detailed interviews with neighbors and other farmers in the area to determine whether anyone had witnessed Marcus's visit to the Brennan farm or had noticed anything unusual in the days following his disappearance. The rural setting of the farm meant that visitors were often noticed by neighbors, and the investigators hoped that someone might have seen Marcus's distinctive white pickup truck in the area. Jim Patterson, whose farm bordered the Brennan property, provided crucial information about the timeline of events. Patterson told investigators that he had seen a white pickup truck parked at the Brennan farm on a Tuesday afternoon in early September, approximately 6 weeks before the barn fire. The truck had remained at the farm for several hours, which Patterson had thought was unusual, but not particularly suspicious at the time. Patterson's timeline matched the date when Marcus Chen's cell phone had last been active, providing confirmation that Marcus had indeed visited the Brennan farm on the day he disappeared. The witness testimony also supported the theory that Marcus had been killed during his visit to the farm, rather than being transported there after being murdered elsewhere. Sarah McKinney, who worked at the regional agricultural supply store, provided additional insight into Thomas Brennan's state of mind during the weeks following Marcus's disappearance. McKinney told investigators that Thomas had visited the store several times in September, asking about equipment and supplies but seeming nervous and distracted. She had attributed his behavior to the stress of harvest season, but in retrospect his demeanor seemed consistent with someone who was dealing with the aftermath of committing murder. McKinney also mentioned that Thomas had asked several questions about accelerants and fire safety, inquiring about how quickly different materials would burn and what kind of evidence might survive a major fire. At the time, she had assumed he was concerned about fire prevention on his farm, but the questions took on a more sinister meaning in light of the subsequent barn fire and the discovery of Marcus's remains. The investigation into Thomas's financial situation revealed additional evidence that supported the robbery motive for Marcus's murder. Bank records showed that Thomas had made a cash deposit of $12,000 just 3 days after Marcus's disappearance, money that he claimed came from the sale of grain to a local elevator. However, when investigators contacted the grain elevator, they found no record of any transaction with Thomas Brennan during that time period. The mysterious cash deposit was significant because it closely matched the amount of money that Marcus had been carrying for equipment sales. Lisa Rodriguez had told investigators that Marcus typically carried between $10,000 and $15,000, making the $12,000 deposit highly suspicious. Thomas's inability to provide documentation for the source of the money further strengthened the case against him. Foster's team also discovered that Thomas had researched barn fires and insurance claims on his home computer in the weeks following Marcus's disappearance. Internet search records showed that he had looked up information about fire investigation techniques, how long it took for bodies to decompose, and what kind of evidence could be destroyed by high-temperature fires. These searches suggested premeditation and planning rather than panic following an impulsive crime. The digital evidence was particularly damaging because it showed that Thomas had been thinking about destroying evidence and collecting insurance money weeks before the actual fire occurred. This contradicted any potential claim that the fire had been accidental or that Thomas had been acting in panic following an unplanned confrontation with Marcus. The insurance investigation revealed that Thomas had increased his coverage on the barn and its contents just 3 months before the fire, raising the total coverage from $60,000 to over $120,000. The timing of this increase, combined with the farm's desperate financial situation, provided additional evidence that Thomas had been planning to burn the barn as a way to collect insurance money while destroying evidence of Marcus's murder. Insurance investigator Robert Chen, no relation to the victim, had been assigned to handle the Brennan claim and had immediately noticed several red flags that suggested potential fraud. The increased coverage, the timing of the fire during harvest season when the barn would contain valuable equipment and grain, and the convenient absence of the family from the immediate area when the fire started all raised suspicions about the legitimacy of the claim. Chen's investigation revealed that Thomas had been struggling to make insurance payments in recent months, falling behind on premiums before catching up with payments just before the fire occurred. This pattern suggested that Thomas had been planning the fire for some time, and had ensured that his insurance was current before implementing his plan. The case against Thomas Brennan was strengthened by the testimony of Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic anthropologist who had supervised the recovery of Marcus's remains. Dr. Williams testified that the positioning of the body and the way it had been concealed suggested deliberate burial rather than accidental concealment. The remains had been covered with tarps and heavy objects in a way that would prevent detection by odor or casual observation. Dr. Williams also testified about the timeline of decomposition, explaining that Marcus had been dead for several weeks before the fire occurred. This timeline matched the period when Thomas had been acting nervously and making suspicious financial transactions, providing additional circumstantial evidence of his guilt. The forensic evidence was compelling, but Foster knew that successful prosecution would require establishing a clear motive and timeline for the crime. The financial pressure facing Thomas Brennan provided a logical motive for robbery, and the physical evidence showed that Marcus had been killed at the Brennan farm. However, proving that Thomas had planned and executed the murder would require careful presentation of all the evidence to demonstrate his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As the investigation continued, Detective Foster learned more about Thomas Brennan's financial situation. The farm had been struggling for several years, with declining crop prices and increased equipment costs putting significant strain on the family's resources. Thomas had taken out multiple loans using the farm as collateral and was behind on several payments. The pressure to find additional income may have created a motive for his actions. Neighbors began coming forward with information that painted a picture of Thomas's increasing desperation. Jim Patterson, whose farm bordered the Brennan property, mentioned that Thomas had approached him about selling part of his land, but had become angry when Jim declined to make an offer. Sarah McKinney, who worked at the local agricultural supply store, recalled that Thomas had been asking about expensive equipment but seemed frustrated when he learned about payment terms and interest rates. The investigation revealed that Marcus Chen had been carrying a significant amount of cash when he visited farms, as many agricultural equipment sales in the area were still conducted with immediate payment. His girlfriend Lisa confirmed that Marcus often carried between $10,000 and $15,000 for demonstrations and immediate purchases. This money was never found, either with Marcus's remains or anywhere else on the Brennan property. Detective Foster's theory began to take shape. Marcus Chen had visited Thomas Brennan to discuss irrigation equipment, carrying cash for potential sales. At some point during the visit, Thomas had decided to rob Marcus, leading to a confrontation that resulted in Marcus's death. Thomas had then hidden the body in his barn, hoping it would never be discovered. The fire had been set deliberately to destroy evidence, but the plan had backfired when investigators found the remains. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the fire. Detective Foster and her team arrived at the Brennan farm with a warrant for Thomas's arrest on charges of second-degree homicide and tampering with evidence. Thomas offered no resistance but maintained his innocence, claiming that the evidence had been misinterpreted and that he was being framed for something he did not do. Margaret Brennan's world collapsed when she learned the full extent of the allegations against her husband. In 35 years of marriage, she had never suspected Thomas capable of violence. She told investigators that while Thomas had been under financial stress, she had seen no signs of the desperation that might lead to such extreme actions. Her faith in her husband, and in her ability to judge character, was severely shaken. The community's reaction to Thomas's arrest was mixed. Some residents expressed shock and disbelief, citing Thomas's reputation as a hard-working, honest farmer who had never been in trouble with the law. Others pointed to his recent behavior changes and financial difficulties as signs that they had missed or chosen to ignore. The arrest of Thomas Brennan came on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 2 weeks after the discovery of Marcus Chen's remains in the barn ruins. Detective Foster had spent those 2 weeks meticulously building a case that would satisfy the requirements for charges of first-degree homicide, evidence tampering, insurance fraud, and arson. The warrant for Thomas's arrest was signed by District Judge Patricia Morrison at 6 in the morning, and Foster's team was at the Brennan farm by 7. Thomas offered no resistance when Foster and her officers arrived at his door, though his face showed the strain of 2 weeks spent waiting for the inevitable. He had aged visibly since the investigation began, his hair seeming grayer, and his shoulders carrying the weight of secrets that had finally been exposed. Margaret stood in the doorway watching as her husband of 35 years was handcuffed and placed in the back of a state police vehicle, her world collapsing around her as the reality of the charges became clear. The arrest sent shockwaves through Millbrook County, where residents had been following the investigation with a mixture of fascination and horror. The idea that one of their neighbors could be capable of murder challenged everything they thought they knew about their community and the people they trusted. Coffee shops, church gatherings, and school board meetings became forums for discussing the case and its implications for their tight-knit rural society. Local newspaper editor James Wilson found himself covering the biggest story in the county's recent history, struggling to balance the community's need for information with respect for the families involved. The Millbrook County Herald, which typically focused on agricultural news, school sports, and community events, suddenly found itself dealing with a criminal case that attracted attention from regional and even national media outlets. Television news crews from Omaha and Lincoln descended on Millbrook, setting up their satellite trucks on Main Street and interviewing anyone willing to talk about Thomas Brennan and the shocking discovery at his farm. The attention was unwelcome in a community that valued privacy and was unaccustomed to dealing with outside scrutiny of their internal affairs. Margaret Brennan found herself isolated and overwhelmed by the collapse of everything she had believed about her life and marriage. Neighbors who had been friends for decades struggled with how to respond to her situation, unsure whether to offer support to a woman who was clearly innocent or to maintain distance from someone whose husband stood accused of heinous crimes. The social fabric of the community was stretched to its breaking point as people grappled with conflicting emotions and loyalties. The Brennan children faced their own challenges as news of their father's arrest spread beyond the local community. Michael, who was farming in Iowa, found himself fielding questions from neighbors and customers who had seen the news coverage. Sarah, working as a nurse in Omaha, had to deal with colleagues who recognized the family name from news reports. David, stationed in Germany with the Army, struggled with being thousands of miles away from his family during their greatest crisis. Thomas's initial court appearance was held in the Millbrook County Courthouse, a century-old building that had never hosted proceedings of such magnitude. County Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who typically dealt with traffic violations, property disputes, and minor criminal matters, found herself prosecuting the most serious case of her career. Walsh had requested assistance from the state attorney general's office, bringing in experienced prosecutors who could handle the complexities of a first-degree murder case. Defense attorney Robert Kim, a public defender from Lincoln with experience in capital cases, was appointed to represent Thomas after it became clear that the family could not afford private counsel. Kim faced the challenge of defending a client against overwhelming physical evidence, while trying to understand how a seemingly ordinary farmer could have committed such violent crimes. The preliminary hearing revealed the strength of the prosecution's case and the challenges facing the defense. Prosecutor Walsh presented evidence that included DNA linking Marcus Chen to the Brennan Farm Workshop, financial records showing Thomas's desperate situation and suspicious cash deposits, digital evidence of Thomas's research into fire investigation techniques, and witness testimony placing Marcus at the farm on the day he disappeared. Kim's defense strategy initially focused on challenging the physical evidence and raising questions about the investigation's thoroughness. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that other explanations were possible for Marcus's presence at the farm and his subsequent death. However, as more evidence was presented, it became clear that the prosecution's case was built on solid scientific foundations that would be difficult to challenge successfully. The trial began 6 months after Thomas's arrest, held in the district court in the county seat due to the magnitude of the case and the extensive media attention it had generated. Judge William Harrison, a veteran of 25 years on the bench, presided over proceedings that would determine whether Thomas Brennan would spend the rest of his life in prison for the murder of Marcus Chen. Prosecutor Walsh opened the trial by presenting a clear narrative of premeditation and cold-blooded murder motivated by financial desperation. She argued that Thomas had planned to rob Marcus Chen from the moment he agreed to meet with the equipment salesman, knowing that sales representatives often carried substantial amounts of cash for immediate transactions. The prosecution's theory was that Thomas had lured Marcus to the isolated farm workshop, attacked him with a tool or piece of equipment, and then concealed the body in the barn while planning to destroy the evidence through arson. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks with testimony from dozens of witnesses and presentation of hundreds of pieces of evidence. Detective Foster testified about the investigation process and the discovery of evidence linking Thomas to the crime. Dr. Vaughn presented the autopsy findings that established the cause and manner of Marcus's death. Forensic specialists explained the DNA evidence, blood spatter analysis, and digital forensics that connected Thomas to the crime. Financial expert Sandra Matthews, a certified public accountant who specialized in agricultural economics, testified about Thomas's desperate financial situation and the pressure he faced to avoid losing the family farm. Matthews explained how the combination of debt, declining crop prices, and poor yields had created a perfect storm that threatened to destroy the Brennan family's livelihood and force them into bankruptcy. Insurance investigator Robert Chen presented evidence about the suspicious circumstances surrounding the barn fire and Thomas's recent increase in insurance coverage. Chen testified that the timing and nature of the fire, combined with Thomas's financial situation, created a pattern consistent with insurance fraud designed to provide money while destroying evidence of more serious crimes. Perhaps the most damaging testimony came from computer forensic specialist David Park, who had analyzed Thomas's internet search history and found extensive evidence of premeditation. Park testified that Thomas had researched fire investigation techniques, body decomposition rates, and insurance claim procedures in the weeks following Marcus's disappearance, suggesting that he had been planning the barn fire as a way to destroy evidence and collect insurance money. The prosecution also presented testimony from Marcus's girlfriend, Lisa Rodriguez, who provided insight into Marcus's character and his activities during his final weeks. Lisa's emotional testimony about their relationship and their plans for the future helped humanize the victim and demonstrated the impact of Thomas's actions on innocent people who had loved Marcus and counted on him for their own happiness and security. Defense attorney Kim faced an uphill battle in challenging the prosecution's evidence, but he focused on raising questions about the investigation's assumptions and the possibility that someone else could have committed the crime. Kim argued that the evidence, while substantial, was circumstantial, and that reasonable doubt existed about Thomas's guilt. The defense called witnesses who testified about Thomas's character and reputation in the community, hoping to convince the jury that he was not the type of person who could commit murder. Neighbors, church members, and business associates testified that Thomas had always been honest, hardworking, and nonviolent, making it difficult to believe that he could have committed such brutal crimes. Margaret Brennan's testimony on behalf of her husband was the emotional centerpiece of the defense case. She took the stand despite the personal cost, describing 35 years of marriage to a man she characterized as gentle and honest, someone who had never raised his voice to her or their children, and who had always tried to solve problems through hard work rather than violence. Margaret's testimony was compelling and brought many in the courtroom to tears, but it could not overcome the weight of physical evidence linking Thomas to Marcus's murder. While character witnesses could testify to Thomas's previous behavior, they could not explain away the DNA evidence, the suspicious financial transactions, or the digital evidence of his research into destroying evidence. Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic anthropologist who had supervised the recovery of Marcus's remains, provided testimony that effectively countered the defense's suggestions that Marcus might have been killed elsewhere and his body transported to the Brennan farm. Dr. Williams explained that the positioning of the remains and the way they had been concealed indicated that Marcus had been buried at the farm deliberately, rather than being dumped there by someone else. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the impossibility of explaining Thomas's behavior through innocent means. Prosecutor Walsh argued that the combination of physical evidence, financial motive, suspicious behavior, and digital evidence created a pattern that could only be explained by Thomas's guilt in murdering Marcus Chen and attempting to cover up the crime. The jury deliberation lasted 3 days, during which the 12 citizens of Millbrook County wrestled with the evidence and the implications of their decision. The jury included farmers, shop owners, and retired residents who understood the pressures facing agricultural communities, but also recognized their responsibility to deliver justice for Marcus Chen and his family. The foreman of the jury, retired teacher Harold Peterson, later described the deliberation as one of the most difficult experiences of his life. The jurors had to reconcile their knowledge of Thomas Brennan as a neighbor and community member with the evidence that he had committed a brutal murder, motivated by greed and desperation. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable as Judge Harrison asked for their verdict. Thomas stood with his attorney, his face pale and his hands trembling as he awaited the decision that would determine the rest of his life. Margaret sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by their children who had returned from their various locations to support their mother during the trial's conclusion. The verdict was guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, evidence tampering, insurance fraud, and arson. The jury had found beyond a reasonable doubt that Thomas Brennan had deliberately killed Marcus Chen during a robbery attempt and had then attempted to cover up his crime through elaborate deception and the destruction of evidence. Thomas showed no emotion as the verdict was read, though Margaret collapsed in her seat and had to be assisted by her children. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobbing of Marcus's girlfriend Lisa and his family members, who had attended every day of the trial seeking justice for the man they had loved. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, allowing time for the preparation of victim impact statements and pre-sentence reports that would guide his decision about Thomas's punishment. Under Nebraska law, first-degree murder carried a potential sentence of life in prison without parole, a penalty that would effectively end Thomas's life as a free man. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for Marcus's family and friends to address the court about the impact of his murder on their lives. Lisa Rodriguez delivered a powerful statement about the future she and Marcus had planned together and the devastating effect of losing the man she had intended to marry. Marcus's parents, who had flown in from California, spoke about their son's character and the senseless waste of a life that had been full of promise and potential. Thomas was given an opportunity to address the court before sentencing, but he chose to remain silent, offering no apology or explanation for his actions. His decision not to speak left many questions unanswered about his motivations and whether he felt any remorse for the pain he had caused to so many innocent people. Judge Harrison sentenced Thomas to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction, plus additional consecutive sentences for the other charges that brought his total sentence to life plus 15 years. The judge noted that while Thomas had no prior criminal record, the calculated nature of his actions and his attempts to conceal the crime warranted the maximum possible punishment. The conclusion of the trial marked the end of a legal process that had consumed the community for nearly a year, but the healing process would take much longer. Margaret Brennan faced the challenge of rebuilding her life without her husband while dealing with the financial ruin that his crimes had brought upon their family. The farm was sold to pay legal costs and settle debts, forcing Margaret to move to a small apartment in town where she lived quietly, still struggling to understand how her marriage had concealed such dark secrets. The Brennan children struggled with their own feelings of anger, betrayal, and confusion as they tried to reconcile their memories of their father with the reality of his crimes. Family relationships were strained as they dealt with different approaches to coping with the scandal and its aftermath. Some family members chose to maintain their belief in Thomas's innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, while others accepted his guilt, but struggled with feelings of shame and anger. The impact on the broader community was profound and lasting. Many residents installed security systems for the first time, reflecting a loss of the sense of safety that had defined rural life for generations. Farmers began working in pairs when meeting with unfamiliar salespeople or contractors, and parents kept closer watch on their children's activities and whereabouts. The annual Harvest Festival, which had been a celebration of community cooperation and shared values, was canceled that year as residents struggled to process what had happened among them. Church attendance increased as people sought comfort and guidance in dealing with the tragedy, but conversations often focused on the difficulty of understanding how evil could exist in their midst. Fire Chief Martinez instituted new protocols for fire investigations, ensuring that any suspicious blaze would be treated as a potential crime scene until proven otherwise. The experience had taught the department that even routine emergencies could conceal serious crimes and that thorough investigation was essential to ensuring that justice was served. Detective Foster received commendations from the state police and the Attorney General's office for her thorough investigation of the case. She said the experience had reinforced her belief that financial desperation could drive even seemingly ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence, and that investigators should never make assumptions about people based on their reputation or standing in the community. The case became a subject of study for law enforcement agencies throughout the region, providing lessons about the importance of thorough crime scene investigation and the need to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating potential suspects. The combination of traditional detective work and modern forensic techniques had been crucial to solving the case and obtaining justice for Marcus Chen. Dr. Vaughn, who had conducted the autopsy that provided crucial evidence about Marcus's death, said the case had been a reminder of why thoroughness in death investigations was so important. If the fire had completely destroyed the remains, or if investigators had not been as careful in their examination of the scene, Marcus's family might never have known what happened to him, and Thomas Brennan might never have been held accountable for his actions. The case also highlighted the pressures facing family farmers in an economy where margins were thin and unexpected expenses could threaten generations of work. Agricultural organizations used the tragedy as an example of why mental health resources and financial counseling should be readily available to farming families facing difficult times, hoping to prevent future tragedies through early intervention and support. 3 years after his conviction, Thomas Brennan remained in the Nebraska State Penitentiary, where he had participated in educational programs and earned his general equivalency diploma. He had written letters of apology to Marcus Chen's family, though they had chosen not to respond to his attempts at communication. Prison officials described him as a model inmate who had shown no disciplinary problems, but continued to maintain his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The letters Thomas wrote provided some insight into his mindset and his inability to accept responsibility for his actions. He continued to claim that he had been framed for crimes he did not commit, suggesting that the real killer had planted evidence at his farm and that the investigation had been biased against him from the beginning. Mental health professionals who had evaluated Thomas suggested that his inability to accept responsibility might be a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to cope with the magnitude of his actions. Margaret Brennan had gradually rebuilt her life in the years following the trial, finding work as a clerk at the local library and slowly reconnecting with friends who had initially distanced themselves from her family. She remained convinced of her husband's innocence despite the evidence presented at trial, a belief that provided her with some comfort, but also prevented her from fully processing the trauma of discovering that the man she had loved and trusted for 35 years was capable of murder. The farmstead where the Brennan family had lived for 3 generations was purchased by a young couple from Colorado, who were unaware of its history when they made their offer. They had worked to restore the property and had built a new barn to replace the one destroyed in the fire, though they learned about the property's dark past from neighbors after moving in. Some local residents still avoided driving past the former Brennan farm, unable to forget what had happened there and the way it had shattered their sense of security. The red barn that had once served as a landmark and gathering place for community events was gone, replaced by a modern structure that served the same practical purpose, but lacked the history and memories that had made the original building special. Marcus Chen's memory lived on through a scholarship fund established by his girlfriend Lisa Rodriguez and his family. The Marcus Chen Memorial Scholarship provided financial assistance to students pursuing careers in agricultural business, ensuring that his passion for helping farmers would continue to benefit others long after his death. The scholarship had helped dozens of young people begin careers in agriculture, creating a positive legacy from a tragedy that had taken so much from so many people. Lisa Rodriguez had eventually found the strength to move forward with her life, though she said that a part of her would always grieve for the future she and Marcus had planned together. She had married another man several years after the trial and had started a family, but she continued to manage the scholarship fund and to speak at events about the importance of supporting victims' families in the aftermath of violent crimes. The case remained a defining moment in the history of Millbrook County, a reminder that evil could exist anywhere, and that the people closest to us might harbor secrets capable of destroying lives. But it also demonstrated the resilience of rural communities and their ability to come together in the face of tragedy, supporting one another through the most difficult circumstances, and working to rebuild trust and security in the wake of devastating betrayal. For law enforcement professionals, the case served as a model of how thorough investigation and modern forensic techniques could solve even the most challenging crimes. The collaboration between local, state, and federal agencies had been crucial to uncovering the truth and ensuring that justice was served, proving that rural communities had access to the same investigative resources as urban areas when serious crimes occurred. The story of Thomas Brennan and Marcus Chen ultimately served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of financial desperation and the importance of seeking help when life's challenges become overwhelming. It demonstrated that there are always alternatives to violence, and that the temporary relief that crime might seem to offer always comes at a cost far greater than the original problem. Perhaps most importantly, the case illustrated the value of human life and the devastating impact that violence has on families and communities. Marcus Chen's death had created ripples of pain and trauma that extended far beyond his immediate family, affecting an entire community's sense of safety and trust. His memory served as a reminder that every life has value, and that justice, while it cannot restore what has been lost, provides some measure of comfort to those left behind. As the years passed and the immediate shock of the case faded, the people of Millbrook County continued to grapple with its lessons and implications. The tragedy had changed them in fundamental ways, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil that exists within everyone. But it had also strengthened their commitment to looking out for one another, and their determination to build a community where such tragedies could be prevented through early intervention and support for those facing crisis. The abandoned foundation where the original Brennan barn had stood was eventually filled in and planted with prairie grass, creating a peaceful meadow that showed no signs of the violence that had occurred there. A small memorial stone placed by Marcus Chen's family marked the location, serving as a quiet reminder of a life cut short by greed and desperation, and as a testament to the importance of choosing hope over fear when facing life's greatest challenges. The abandoned foundation where the original Brennan barn had stood was eventually filled in and planted with prairie grass, creating a peaceful meadow that showed no signs of the violence that had occurred there. A small memorial stone placed by Marcus Chen's family marked the location, serving as a quiet reminder of a life cut short by greed and desperation, and as a testament to the importance of choosing hope over fear when facing life's greatest challenges. The inscription on the memorial stone read simply, Marcus Chen, 1989 to 2023, a life of service to farming communities. Taken too soon, remembered always. Below these words was a small engraving of corn stalks, representing Marcus's dedication to helping farmers improve their operations and his belief in the importance of agriculture to America's future. Every year on the anniversary of Marcus's death, Lisa Rodriguez and his family gathered at the memorial for a brief ceremony that honored his memory and reinforced their commitment to the scholarship fund that bore his name. The gathering was small and private, but it served as an important ritual that helped keep Marcus's memory alive and provided comfort to those who had loved him. The ceremony also served as a reminder to the broader community about the value of human life and the importance of resolving conflicts through peaceful means. Local clergy often attended the memorial service, offering prayers for Marcus's soul and for the healing of all those affected by the tragedy. The service had become an annual moment of reflection for the entire community, a time to remember the lessons learned from the case and to recommit to supporting one another through difficult times. In the years following the trial, several other agricultural communities throughout the Midwest reached out to Millbrook County for guidance in dealing with the financial pressures facing family farmers. The case had highlighted the need for better support systems and early intervention programs that could help farming families before financial stress led to desperate actions. The University of Nebraska Extension Service developed a new program based partly on lessons learned from the Brennan case, providing financial counseling and mental health resources specifically designed for agricultural families. The program included workshops on stress management, debt restructuring, and alternative income sources that could help farms survive difficult economic periods without resorting to illegal activities. Agricultural lenders throughout the region also changed their practices in response to the case, implementing new protocols for identifying farmers who might be at risk of defaulting on loans and providing early intervention services that could help prevent financial disasters. The goal was to address problems before they became overwhelming and to ensure that farmers understood all of their legal options for dealing with debt. The Nebraska Farm Bureau Federation used the case as the basis for educational materials about financial planning and stress management, distributing resources to farming communities throughout the state. The materials emphasized that seeking help was a sign of strength rather than weakness, and that temporary financial difficulties did not have to result in permanent loss of family farms. Mental health professionals who worked with rural communities noted that the case had helped reduce some of the stigma associated with seeking counseling and therapy. The recognition that even respected community members could be driven to violence by financial pressure had made it easier for other farmers to acknowledge their own struggles and seek appropriate help before problems became unmanageable. Churches throughout the region developed new ministries focused on supporting farming families during difficult economic times, providing both spiritual guidance and practical assistance with everything from financial planning to emotional support. These programs recognized that faith communities had an important role to play in preventing tragedies like the one that had devastated Millbrook County. The case also prompted changes in how agricultural equipment companies trained their sales representatives and handled the security of cash carried for demonstrations and immediate sales. Many companies implemented new policies requiring electronic payments rather than cash transactions, reducing the temptation for robbery and improving the safety of their employees. Midwest Agricultural Solutions, the company where Marcus had worked, established new safety protocols for their sales staff that included mandatory check-ins with supervisors, GPS tracking of company vehicles, and requirements that large cash transactions be conducted at the company's offices rather than on customer properties. These changes were designed to protect employees while still allowing them to serve their agricultural customers effectively. The company also created an annual award in Marcus's honor, recognizing sales representatives who demonstrated exceptional commitment to customer service and agricultural education. The Marcus Chen Excellence Award became one of the most prestigious recognitions in the agricultural equipment industry, serving to keep his memory alive while encouraging others to follow his example of genuine concern for farmer success. Law enforcement agencies throughout Nebraska used the case as a training example for investigators, demonstrating the importance of thorough crime scene examination and the value of modern forensic techniques in solving complex cases. The collaboration between local, state, and federal agencies had been crucial to the successful prosecution, and the case became a model for how rural jurisdictions could access advanced investigative resources when needed. The Nebraska State Patrol developed new training materials based on the case, emphasizing the need to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating potential suspects and the importance of following evidence wherever it might lead. The training stressed that financial desperation could motivate violence in people who had no previous history of criminal behavior, making it important for investigators to thoroughly examine all aspects of a suspect's life and circumstances. Fire investigation techniques were also improved as a result of the case, with new protocols for preserving potential crime scenes and coordinating with criminal investigators when suspicious circumstances were discovered. The collaboration between Fire Inspector Richardson and Detective Foster had been essential to solving the case, and their successful partnership became a template for similar investigations. The case was eventually featured in several true crime documentaries and books, bringing national attention to the challenges facing family farmers and the importance of supporting rural communities during difficult economic times. While the attention was sometimes unwelcome in Millbrook County, it also served to educate broader audiences about agricultural issues and the human cost of financial pressure. Academic researchers studying rural crime and agricultural economics used the case as an example of how external economic forces could contribute to local tragedies. The research helped policymakers understand the need for better support systems for farming communities and the importance of maintaining strong rural economies that could provide alternatives to agriculture when family farms failed. The case also influenced discussions about criminal justice reform and the need for programs that could address the root causes of crime rather than simply punishing offenders after crimes had been committed. While Thomas Brennan would remain in prison for the rest of his life, the tragedy that had led to his crimes might have been prevented through earlier intervention and support. Prison officials noted that Thomas had become involved in programs designed to help inmates understand the impact of their crimes on victims and communities. While he continued to maintain his innocence publicly, counselors believed that he was beginning to acknowledge privately the pain his actions had caused to so many innocent people. The programs Thomas participated in included victim impact education, where inmates learned about the lasting effects of crime on families and communities. Although Marcus Chen's family had chosen not to participate directly in these programs, their written statements about the impact of his death were shared with inmates as part of their educational process. Thomas also completed educational programs that earned him a college degree in agricultural business, a bitter irony given that his financial struggles as a farmer had contributed to the crimes that had landed him in prison. Prison educators noted that Thomas was a model student who helped other inmates with their studies, though his motivation remained unclear. The correspondence between Thomas and various pen pals revealed his ongoing struggle to understand how his life had gone so wrong, and his attempts to find meaning in his current circumstances. Some letters showed genuine remorse for his actions, while others continued to maintain his innocence or blame others for his situation. Margaret Brennan gradually found peace in her new life, though she never fully recovered from the shock of learning about her husband's crimes. She became involved in support groups for families of violent offenders, helping other women who struggled with feelings of guilt, shame, and confusion about their relationships with men who had committed serious crimes. Her work with these support groups became a source of healing and purpose that helped her move forward despite the trauma she had experienced. Margaret often spoke about the importance of recognizing that the families of perpetrators were also victims of violence, deserving of support and understanding rather than blame and isolation. The Brennan children pursued different paths in dealing with their father's crimes and the impact on their family. Michael continued farming in Iowa but struggled with depression and anxiety that required ongoing treatment. Sarah left nursing temporarily to pursue counseling training, hoping to help other families affected by violence. David completed his military service and became a police officer, motivated partly by his desire to prevent tragedies like the one that had destroyed his family. Each of the Brennan children had to make difficult decisions about their relationship with their father and their approach to his continued claims of innocence. Some maintained limited contact with Thomas, while others chose to cut ties completely, finding that his refusal to accept responsibility made it impossible to maintain a relationship. The extended Brennan family was also affected by the case, with aunts, uncles, and cousins struggling to understand how someone they had known and trusted could be capable of such violence. Family gatherings became strained affairs where the case was either discussed endlessly or avoided completely, with both approaches creating tension and discomfort. As the 10th anniversary of Marcus Chen's death approached, the community of Millbrook County continued to grapple with the legacy of the case and its impact on their sense of identity and security. The town had slowly healed from the immediate trauma, but the memory of what had happened served as a permanent reminder of the complexity of human nature and the potential for good people to make terrible choices. Young people who had grown up hearing about the case understood its lessons about the importance of seeking help when facing overwhelming problems and the devastating consequences that could result from choosing violence over communication. Schools in the area incorporated discussions about the case into their character education programs, using it as an example of how poor choices could destroy multiple lives. The case had become part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale that parents shared with their children and that new residents learned about as part of understanding their community's history. While the details were sometimes exaggerated or distorted in the retelling, the core message remained consistent, that financial pressure and desperation should never be allowed to drive people to violence. Economic conditions in agricultural communities throughout the Midwest had improved somewhat in the years following the case, but the underlying vulnerabilities that had contributed to Thomas Brennan's crimes remained present. Commodity prices continued to fluctuate unpredictably, weather patterns became increasingly erratic due to climate change, and the costs of farming continued to rise faster than farm income. The ongoing economic challenges meant that the lessons of the Brennan case remained relevant for farming communities throughout the region. The case served as a reminder that even stable, well-established operations could face sudden financial crisis, and that community support systems needed to be in place to help families before problems became overwhelming. Religious leaders throughout agricultural communities continued to reference the case in sermons and counseling sessions, using it as an example of how isolation and pride could prevent people from seeking help when they needed it most. The case reinforced the importance of maintaining strong community connections and of creating environments where people felt comfortable sharing their struggles without fear of judgment or shame. The memorial scholarship established in Marcus Chen's name had grown significantly over the years, providing assistance to dozens of students pursuing agricultural careers. The scholarship recipients often wrote thank you letters to Marcus's family, describing how the financial assistance had made their education possible and how they planned to honor his memory through their work in agriculture. One scholarship recipient, a young woman named Sarah Martinez who had grown up on a farm similar to the Brennan operation, wrote particularly movingly about how Marcus's story had influenced her decision to pursue a career in agricultural financial counseling. She explained that she wanted to help farming families navigate financial difficulties without resorting to the desperate measures that had destroyed so many lives in Millbrook County. Sarah's career path represented exactly the kind of positive outcome that Marcus's family had hoped to achieve through the scholarship program. By supporting students who were committed to helping agricultural communities, the scholarship ensured that Marcus's passion for supporting farmers would continue to make a difference long after his death. The scholarship program also included annual workshops and seminars where recipients could learn about agricultural economics, financial planning, and stress management. These educational components were designed to prepare the next generation of agricultural professionals to recognize and address the warning signs that could lead to tragedies, like the one that had taken Marcus's life. As time passed and the immediate pain of the case began to fade, the community of Millbrook County found ways to honor both Marcus's memory and the lessons learned from the tragedy. The annual memorial service grew to include broader discussions about community support, financial literacy, and mental health resources, transforming a moment of grief into an opportunity for education and prevention. The case of Thomas Brennan and Marcus Chen ultimately served as a powerful reminder that the choices people make in moments of crisis can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. It demonstrated the importance of building strong communities where people feel supported and valued, where seeking help is encouraged rather than stigmatized, and where alternatives to violence are always available and accessible. For the people of Millbrook County, the case represented both their greatest tragedy and their most important lesson. It had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the potential for evil that exists within everyone, but it had also strengthened their commitment to supporting one another and preventing future tragedies through early intervention and community care. The story continues to resonate with agricultural communities throughout America, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of financial desperation, while also demonstrating the power of community resilience and the importance of seeking justice for victims of violence. It reminds us that every life has value, that every choice has consequences, and that the bonds of community are both fragile and essential to our collective well-being. In the end, the legacy of Marcus Chen and the tragedy that took his life serves as a testament to the importance of choosing hope over despair, seeking help over isolation, and building communities where people are valued for who they are, rather than judged for their struggles. It is a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in the aftermath of that terrible October night, when a barn fire revealed secrets that would forever change a community's understanding of itself and the people it thought it knew.